In 1931, the Browning Arms Company unveiled what it called a revolutionary new shotgun. The world believed them. Gun writers celebrated it. Sporting estates across Europe ordered it. Within a decade, it had become the best-selling over and under shotgun in history. There was one problem. The mechanical heart of that gun, the action geometry, the barrel relationship, the locking system that made it work had already been patented. 22 years earlier, by a 12-man workshop on the corner of Dover Street, London, that most Americans had never heard of. The workshop was called Boss & Company. They received no royalty, no acknowledgement, no litigation settlement. What they received instead was the quiet confirmation of something the London trade had known since 1909, that John Robertson, the Scottish-born craftsman who ran Boss & Company from a rented room above a gunmaker's shop, had solved the over and under problem so completely that no one who came after him could improve upon the solution. They could only reproduce it. By 1990, Boss & Company was producing fewer than 30 guns per year. The companies building on Robertson's mechanical grammar were turning over hundreds of millions. This is not a story about a patent dispute. It is the story of what happens when a craft reaches perfection and the world industrializes the answer while the craftsman stands still. Every week on this channel, we follow the gun makers, the patents, and the decisions that built or quietly erased the names that defined this trade. Subscribe if that story matters to you. The story begins in London in 1812. Thomas Boss was born in London in 1790 into a city that already understood guns the way Paris understood wine, not merely as products, but as arguments about quality, about taste, about the precise distance between adequate and exceptional. The London gun-making trade in the early 19th century was not a single industry, it was a hierarchy. At its apex stood a small number of makers whose names appeared on the locks and ribs of shotguns carried by the aristocracy, the military, and the crowned heads of Europe. Below them, invisible and essential, worked the craftsmen who actually made the guns, the barrel filers, the stock shapers, the lock fitters, the engravers, men whose hands built reputations that belonged to someone else. Thomas Boss was one of those men. He served his apprenticeship in the workshop of Joseph Manton, a name that requires a moment's pause. Manton was not merely a gun maker. He was by wide contemporary consensus the finest shotgun maker in the world. His address at 6 Dover Street, Piccadilly, was known to every serious shooting man in England. His waiting list ran to years. His prices ran to figures that a clerk or a schoolmaster could not contemplate. To apprentice under Joseph Manton in the first decade of the 19th century was not simply to learn a trade. It was to absorb a philosophy of mechanical precision that no school could teach and no book had yet written down. What Manton taught above everything else was this, that a shotgun is not a tool. It is a proposition. Every dimension, the bend of the stock, the length to the trigger, the weight distribution between hand and muzzle is a claim about how a human body moves through space when it swings at a flying bird. Get one measurement wrong and the gun fights the shooter. Get them all right and the gun disappears. The shooter sees only the bird and the bird falls. Boss learned this. And then in approximately 1812 he left. The precise circumstances of his departure from the Manton orbit are not fully documented. What the historical record shows is that by 1812, Thomas Boss had established his own business initially at premises in the Strand, later consolidating at what would become the address his successors kept for over a century. 73 St. James's Street in the heart of the district where London's gunmakers, bootmakers, hatters, and wine merchants had clustered since the Restoration. St. James's was not a coincidence. It was a declaration. A gunmaker on St. James's Street was addressing a specific clientele, the members of the clubs on Pall Mall, the residents of the Albany, the men who spent August in Scotland and October in Norfolk and needed a gun that performed in both. The early years were modest by the standards of what followed. Boss operated with a small number of outworkers, craftsmen contracted by specialty, as was standard in the London trade, where a single gun might pass through 6 or 7 pairs of hands before it reached the rack. The barrel maker worked separately from the lock maker. The stocker worked separately from both. The actioner, the man who fitted the action, who tuned the lock timing and set the trigger pull to within fractions of a pound, was the rarest and most expensive of all. By the 1830s, Boss & Company had established a reputation sufficient to attract clients who did not need to be told what the name meant. The guns left the workshop on St. James's Street with the Boss name on the rib, the flat strip of metal running between the barrels that the shooter's eye follows to the target. That name in that position was not decoration. It was a warranty. It meant that every component in the gun had been inspected, fitted, and proved by men who understood what the gun would be asked to do and had built it accordingly. Thomas Boss died in 1857. He left behind a business, a client list, and a workshop culture, but not crucially, a son trained to continue it. The business passed through a brief period of uncertainty before landing in 1891, in the hands of a man who would define everything that followed. His name was John Robertson. Robertson was born in Scotland, the son of a working craftsman, and had come to the London trade through the established route of workshop, apprenticeship, and journeyman progression. He was not a businessman in any conventional sense. He was, by all surviving accounts, an engineer in the deepest meaning of the word, a man who looked at a mechanical problem and could not rest until he had found the solution that was not merely workable but correct. There is a difference. Workable solutions proliferate. Correct solutions are rare and recognizable, and they have a quality that Robertson's successors would describe in simple terms: they cannot be improved, only copied. When Robertson took control of Boss & Co. in 1891, the firm was respected but not exceptional. The London trade had several makers of equivalent standing. What Robertson brought was not a new marketing strategy or a new client list. He brought a question that had been troubling the best gun makers in England for 40 years. Why had no one solved the over and under? The question deserved an explanation. A side-by-side shotgun, the configuration that had dominated English gun-making since the flintlock era, places its two barrels next to each other, left and right, on a horizontal plane. The arrangement is natural. It is low. It sits close to the shooter's line of sight. And for driven game shooting across the great English estates of the 19th century, it worked with a consistency that made serious men reluctant to question it. But it had a limitation that no amount of craft could engineer away. Two barrels sitting side by side produce 2 points of impact that are by geometry separated horizontally. At close range, the difference is negligible. At distance, at the 40-yard crossers that defined the great driven pheasant shoots of the Edwardian era, the separation matters. The shooter must choose which barrel and therefore which point of impact to trust. The gun asks a question at the moment of the shot. The best shooting men learned to ignore it. Most could not. The over and under configuration, two barrels stacked vertically, one above the other, eliminates that question entirely. A single sighting plane, a single point of reference. The upper barrel and the lower barrel both align with the same axis that the shooter's eye follows to the bird. The gun, in theory, simply pointed where you looked. In theory. The mechanical problem was the action, the steel housing at the rear of the barrels, where the firing mechanisms live, where the gun hinges open for loading, where the extractors push the spent cartridges clear. On a side-by-side gun, the action is wide and relatively shallow. The geometry of stacked barrels demands something different, an action that is narrow and deep, that locks two barrels arranged vertically with the same security and the same smooth hinge that the side-by-side had refined over 2 centuries. Every serious maker in London had looked at this problem. Most had concluded with varying degrees of reluctance that the mechanical compromises required to solve it outweighed the shooting advantages gained. The action would be too deep, the gun would be too heavy, the balance would shift rearward in a way that would make the gun slow to the shoulder and sluggish on the swing. John Robertson looked at the same problem and reached a different conclusion. Between 1891 and 1909, working in the Boss & Company workshop on St. James's Street with a team that never exceeded 15 craftsmen, Robertson developed what would become the most influential shotgun action of the 20th century. The mechanics of what he achieved require a moment's careful attention because the elegance is in the detail. Robertson's over and under action solved three problems simultaneously. The first was the hinge. He placed the hinge point, the cross pin on which the barrels rotate, when the gun is opened lower than any previous maker had attempted, dropping it to a position that kept the gun's overall height compact and its weight distribution centered between the shooter's hands. This was not a minor adjustment. It changed the geometry of every component that followed from it. The second was the locking system. Robertson used a system of bifurcated lumps, two projections machined into the underside of the barrel assembly that locked into corresponding recesses in the action face, with a mechanical precision that the London proof house, when it tested the gun, would record as exceptional. A lump in gun-making terms is a projection, a shaped block of steel that, when the gun closes, slides into a precisely machined recess in the action body and holds the barrels locked against the force of firing. Robertson's bifurcated arrangement, two lumps rather than one, positions it symmetrically distributed that force across a wider bearing surface, reducing wear and extending the mechanical life of the action beyond anything the side-by-side trade had achieved. The third and most consequential was the single trigger. A conventional double-barreled shotgun requires two triggers, one for each barrel. The shooter's hand must shift between them in the fraction of a second between shots. For most shooters on most days, this is manageable. For a fast-driven bird at 40 yards with a second bird already in the air, it is the difference between two shots and one. Robertson's single-trigger mechanism, patented in 1894, refined continuously until the final form was patented in 1909, allowed both barrels to be fired in sequence from a single trigger blade without any mechanical reset by the shooter. The trigger fires the first barrel. The recoil of the gun resets the mechanism automatically. The second pull fires the second barrel. The shooter's hand never moves from its natural position. The patent was filed at the UK Patent Office on the 23rd of January, 1909. Patent number 1806. The claim language described a system of such mechanical clarity that the examiners raised no substantive objection. It was granted without amendment. The guns that left Boss and company bearing this action were priced in the years before the First World War at between £60 and £80 per pair, roughly equivalent to a skilled London craftsman's annual wages for a matched set. They were not priced for the market. They were priced for a specific clientele that did not regard price as a variable in the decision. That clientele included in the years immediately following the patent grant the Maharaja of Patiala, who ordered 3 pairs. Lord Ripon, widely regarded as the finest game shot in England, who shot Boss guns exclusively from 1912. And a succession of members from the great Yorkshire and Norfolk shooting estates, whose game books recorded year after year the same notation against the largest tallies, Boss over and under London. The action was not merely a commercial product. It was a mechanical argument made in steel that the problem had been solved. What no one said publicly, and everyone in the trade understood, was that the argument was so complete that the only response available to competitors was to wait for the patent to expire and then begin. The Edwardian era was for the English shotgun trade what the California gold rush had been for the American West. A concentration of wealth, appetite, and social ritual that created demand on a scale the previous century could not have imagined, and the following century would not repeat. Between 1900 and 1914, the great driven game shoots of England, Scotland, and Ireland operated at a pitch of organized extravagance that required guns the way a symphony requires instruments. Not one gun. A pair of guns matched in weight balance, trigger pull, and point of impact to within tolerances that only the London best makers could achieve. Sometimes 2 pairs. The serious shot at a Sandringham partridge drive or a Yorkshire grouse moor expected to fire 300 cartridges before lunch. The guns had to perform without hesitation, without variation, and without failure in cold and rain in the particular horizontal sleet that arrives on an English moor in October without apology. Boss & Co. in this climate was not merely surviving. It was defining the standard against which other makers measured themselves. The royal warrant, granted by appointment to His Majesty's household, displayed on the trade card and the gun case and the headed notepaper, was the institutional confirmation of what the shooting world already knew. Boss & Co. held a royal warrant. It was not the only maker to do so, but the manner in which Boss guns performed in royal hands at Sandringham at Balmoral on the Duke of Westminster's estate at Eton ensured that the warrant was not merely ceremonial. It was a working endorsement renewed season after season by the simple evidence of the game books. The international client list in the years between the patent grant and the outbreak of war in 1914 reads as a compressed history of the Edwardian world's upper stratum. The Nizam of Hyderabad, ruler of the wealthiest princely state in British India, a man whose personal fortune was at one point estimated to exceed £2 billion in contemporary terms, ordered from Boss & Company. The Maharaja of Patiala, whose armory was one of the most extensive in Asia, kept Boss guns alongside weapons from every other London maker and preferred the Robertson action for driven game. The Aga Khan, who maintained shooting estates in both England and France, shot Boss. Lord Walsingham, whose record of 1,070 grouse killed in a single day at Blubberhouse's Moor in August 1888, remains unbroken, used Boss guns for the driven portion of that extraordinary and now controversial day. These were not celebrity endorsements in any modern sense. They were the natural consequence of a product that performed at the level the clientele demanded, and that the clientele discussed in their clubs and their lodges and their letters with the specificity of men who understood exactly what they were talking about. Then the war came. On the 4th of August, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. Within weeks, the mechanisms of mobilization had reached every corner of English working life, including the workshops of St. James's Street. The London gun-making trade did not convert to mass military production in the manner of the Birmingham factories or the great American arms plants. The craftsmen of Bond Street and St. James's were not equipped for volume. What they made one at a time by hand to a standard that precluded the shortcuts that mass production requires. What the war took from them was not their machinery. It was their people, the skilled men, the actioners, the barrel filers, the lock fitters, whose hands carried knowledge that no technical manual had ever adequately described. Enlisted or were conscripted or were directed by the Ministry of Munitions to Birmingham and Enfield, where their precision skills were needed on military contracts that the London trade could not fulfill. At Boss & Co., the workforce that Robertson had assembled over 2 decades, men trained to his exacting standards, capable of fitting a single trigger mechanism to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch scattered. Some did not return. Those who did return to a workshop that had stood largely idle for 4 years in a city that had changed in ways that the gun and trade would spend the next decade trying to assess. The losses were not only human. The apprenticeship pipeline, the 7-year progression from workshop boy to journeyman craftsman that had reproduced the London gun-making trade skills across generations, had been broken. A boy who began his apprenticeship in 1913 and went to France in 1916 did not complete his training. The craftsman who would have supervised him in 1917 and 1918 was not there to do it. The knowledge that passed between those 2 men in the daily physical instruction of handwork that cannot be written down did not pass. It simply stopped. Robertson understood this with the clarity of a man who had spent 30 years accumulating exactly the kind of knowledge that had just been interrupted. He rebuilt, slowly. With the men who came back, and the young men who could be trained, understanding that training them to his standard would take years that the business could not always afford to spend. By the early 1920s, Boss & Company was producing again. The guns that left the workshop bore the same address, the same action geometry, the same proof marks from the London Proof House on Commercial Road that had tested every Boss gun since the firm's founding. The Robertson over and under, refined continuously since 1909, was now at its mechanical apex. Gun that the trade's most knowledgeable observers described without significant dissent as the finest over and under action in existence. In 1922, Robertson applied for a further refinement patent on the single trigger mechanism. The application was granted. The action was, if anything, better than it had been in 1914. and in 1923, John Robertson died. He left behind a patent, a workshop, a client list, and a mechanical solution so complete that the men who inherited it would spend the next 70 years living in its shadow. Some of them understanding what they had, others discovering too late that what they held was irreplaceable. He also left behind something he did not intend. The original Boss & Co. over and under patent of 1909 had been granted for a term of 14 years under the Patents and Designs Act of 1907. 14 years from January 1909. The patent expired in January 1923. The same month, Robertson died. Across the Atlantic in Ogden, Utah, a Belgian-born engineer named John Moses Browning had been working on his own over and under design since the early 1920s. Browning was a genius of a different order from Robertson, a prolific inventor whose patents covered more ground in American firearms design than any other single individual. A man whose work for Winchester and Colt had already reshaped the American arms industry twice over. Browning died in 1926 before his over and under design was complete. His son Val Browning and the engineers at Fabrique Nationale in Herstal, Belgium, the company that had been manufacturing Browning's designs under license since 1897, completed the work. The result, introduced to the market in 1931 under the name the Browning Superposed, was the over and under shotgun that would sell in greater numbers than any other in history. The Browning Superposed used a single barrel selector and a mechanical arrangement that collectors and gun writers have been comparing to the Robertson Boss action for 90 years. The dimensions are not identical, the specific mechanical solutions differ in their detail. But the fundamental geometry, the hinge point, the locking arrangement, the sighting plane that Robertson had arrived at through a decade and a half of workshop refinement is present in the Superposed in a form that the London trade recognized immediately and discussed privately with a candor they did not always commit to print. Browning's people said nothing publicly about Boss and Company. They did not need to. The patent had expired. The design was in the precise legal sense free to use. Whether it was free in any other sense is a question that the London trade left unanswered, and that this channel will leave in the same conditions stated, noted, and handed to the viewer to carry. What is not in question is the commercial consequence. The Browning Superposed, manufactured at F.N. Herstal at Volumes the Boss Workshop, could not approach in a decade sold across the United States, across Europe, across the shooting world in numbers that made the name Browning synonymous with the over and under configuration that John Robertson had patented in London 22 years earlier. Boss and Company in the same years was producing between 50 and 80 guns annually, by hand, one at a time, at a price that fewer and fewer clients in the straitened economics of interwar Britain could afford to pay. The world had taken Robertson's answer. Boss and Company still had the question. The decline of Boss & Co. did not arrive as a single event. It arrived the way water finds a crack in stone, slowly and visibly, and then all at once. The first pressure was economic, and it began before the Second World War had ended. The England that emerged from 1945 was not the England that had sent its craftsmen to France in 1914. The driven game shoot, the social institution that had sustained the London best's trade for a century, that had filled the order books of Boss and Purdy and Holland with commissions from men who regarded a matched pair of guns as a routine seasonal expenditure, was in structural retreat. The great estates had been taxed, subdivided, and in many cases sold. The staffs of keepers and beaters that made a driven shoot possible had found other employment during the war and did not return in the same numbers. Death duties introduced under the Finance Act of 1894 and steadily increased through the interwar years had been doing quiet work on the concentration of land and wealth that the shooting trade depended upon. The clientele was not gone, but it was smaller, and it was older, and it was not reproducing itself at the rate that the pre-war order books had assumed it would. Boss and Company responded to this the only way a workshop of its type could respond. It continued to make the same guns to the same standard for the clients who remained. There was no pivot available. The firm had no mass-market product, no military contract to pursue, no export strategy that could compensate for the contraction of the domestic-driven game market. What it had was a reputation and a mechanical inheritance that it could either honor or abandon. It chose to honor it. That choice was not without cost. The second pressure arrived from the continent, and it arrived carrying the Robertson action's own geometry. By the 1950s, the Italian gun-making trade centered in Brescia and the Val Trompia, a valley north of the city whose relationship to gun-making stretched back to the 16th century, had begun producing over and under shotguns at prices that the London best makers could not approach and had no interest in approaching. Beretta, the oldest firearms manufacturer in continuous operation in the world, established in Gardone Val Trompia in 1526. A fact the company's literature has never been shy about stating, had spent the post-war years rebuilding its production capacity with machinery and methods that the London trade regarded with a mixture of professional respect and commercial alarm. The Beretta S55 and its successors, introduced through the 1950s and 1960s, brought the over and under configuration to a price point that made it accessible to the middle-market shooter who had previously accepted a side-by-side as his only realistic option. These were not boss guns. They were not attempting to be boss guns. But they were over and under guns built on mechanical principles that Robertson had established, and that the Italian makers had studied, refined, and industrialized with the same systematic efficiency that F.N. Herstal had applied to the Browning superposed 30 years earlier. Then came the Germans. Krieghoff, established in Suhl in 1886 and relocated to Ulm, after the partition of Germany placed its original factory behind the Iron Curtain, had been producing over and under guns for the clay target market since the 1950s. The Krieghoff K80, introduced in 1980 and still in production today, became the dominant competition shotgun in international clay target, shooting the gun that Olympic and World Championship shooters selected not for its price, which was substantial, but for its mechanical consistency under the conditions of sustained competitive use. Its action geometry, examined by any gunmaker who has held both guns, invites the same conversation that the Browning superposed had invited 50 years earlier. The conversation in gun-making circles always arrived at the same place. And then, Perazzi. Daniele Perazzi established his company in Brescia in 1957, initially producing guns to the design of Ivo Fabri before developing his own action. The Perazzi Memex 8, introduced in the early 1970s and adopted by competition shooters across Europe and America with a speed that suggested the market had been waiting for. Exactly this gun became the instrument of choice for the world's top clay target competitors and remains so. Its mechanical architecture, its locking system, its sighting plane were studied by every serious maker who encountered them. The pattern, by this point, required no further annotation. What Robertson had solved in a London workshop with 15 men and a 14-year patent, the world's gun makers had been building variations upon for 60 years. The variations were sometimes brilliant. They were always derivative, and not one of them generated a royalty, an acknowledgement, or a footnote in their manufacturers' official histories that named the source. Boss and Company watched this from St. James's Street, still making guns, still making them by hand, still making them one at a time. The third pressure was succession, and it was the one that came closest to ending everything. John Robertson's death in 1923 had left the firm in the hands of men who understood what they had inherited, but lacked the specific mechanical genius that had created it. This is not a criticism. Robertson was not replaceable. What he had done over 3 decades at Boss & Co. was accumulate, test, refine, and embody a standard of mechanical knowledge that existed nowhere in written form, only in the guns he had made and the craftsmen he had trained. Those craftsmen aged. The apprenticeship pipeline, already damaged by the First World War, was broken again by the Second. The young men who might have entered the London gun trade in 1939 went instead to the same places their fathers had gone in 1914. When they returned, the trade they came back to was smaller, slower, and less certain of its own future than it had been when they left. Through the 1950s and 1960s, Boss and Company continued. The guns it produced were by every technical measure the equal of anything that had left the workshop before the wars. The Robertson action, maintained and built by men who had learned it directly from those who preceded them, retained its mechanical integrity. But the firm's financial position was not the equal of its technical position. The overheads of a St. James's Street address the cost of maintaining craftsmen whose skills commanded wages that reflected their rarity. The economics of producing 40 guns a year in a market that Beretta was supplying by the thousand. These were not problems that reputation alone could solve. In the 1960s, the ownership of Boss and Company changed hands. The details of the transition are not comprehensively documented in the public record. What is clear is that the firm passed through a period of ownership instability that lasted in various forms. Into the 1990s, a period during which the St. James's Street address was maintained. The Boss name was preserved, and the guns continued to be produced, but in which the institutional continuity that Robertson had built was under sustained pressure from the financial realities that small luxury manufacturers across Britain were confronting simultaneously. By the late 1980s, output had fallen to levels that made the firm's long-term viability a genuine question rather than a rhetorical one. Fewer than 30 guns per year. The St. James's address maintained at considerable cost. The craftsmen numbering fewer than 10. The order book measured in years, not months. The waiting list longer than the annual output could justify. The name intact, the future uncertain. In 1993, the firm was acquired by Arthur de Moules, an American businessman whose connection to the shooting world gave him an understanding of what Boss and Company represented that a purely financial calculation would not have produced. The acquisition was not a rescue in the conventional private equity sense. It was, by the available evidence, an act of informed preservation. A decision by someone who understood that what was being purchased was not merely a brand or a building or an order book, but a specific form of mechanical knowledge that once lost could not be reconstructed from drawings or patents or museum exhibits. The knowledge lived in hands, and hands, if not kept working, forget. Boss & Co. did not close. That sentence, in the context of everything that preceded it, requires a moment to settle. The London best trade of the late 20th century was not a landscape of survival. It was a landscape of closures, consolidations, and quiet endings, firms that had stood on Bond Street in St. James's for 100 years, whose names appeared in the game books of Edwardian England alongside the tallies of kings and maharajas that simply stopped. The reasons were always the same combination: the economics of hand production, the contraction of the driven game market, the succession problem, the cost of a London address against an annual output that no accountant could make viable on paper. Boss & Co. should by those measures have closed. It did not. The de Moules acquisition of 1993 stabilized the firm without transforming it. This was, in retrospect, precisely the correct instinct. Boss & Co. was not a business that needed transformation. It needed continuity. The specific, unglamorous, expensive continuity of keeping skilled hands working on the Robertson action year after year so that the knowledge those hands carried did not expire with the men who held it. The guns that left the Boss & Company workshop in the years following the acquisition were by every technical assessment available the equal of anything the firm had produced in its Edwardian peak. The Robertson over and under action, the bifurcated lump system, the single trigger mechanism, the hinge geometry that Robertson had arrived at through 15 years of workshop refinement was being built by craftsmen who had learned it from craftsmen who had learned it from craftsmen who had worked alongside Robertson himself. The chain of direct transmission was intact. Barely, but intact. Today, Boss & Company operates from premises in Letchworth, Hertfordshire, having relocated from the street. James's Street address that the firm had maintained for the better part of 2 centuries. The relocation was not a retreat. It was an acknowledgement that the economics of a central London workshop in the 21st century are irreconcilable with the economics of hand-producing 50 guns per year. The craft moved. The craft survived. Output today is estimated at between 30 and 50 guns annually. Figures the firm does not publish, in keeping with a tradition of discretion about production numbers that dates to Robertson's era. Waiting times for a new commission run to several years. The price of a new boss over and under in current terms begins in the region of £100,000 and rises with specification. It is not a purchase. It is a commission, the engagement of a specific set of skills over a specific period of time to produce a single object that will perform to a standard that no catalog item can replicate. The collector market for original Boss & Co. guns, particularly pre-war pairs in original Boss cases, with the Robertson single-trigger action in documented working order, reflects a valuation that the new commission price does not fully explain. At Rock Island Auction Company, where significant British best guns appear regularly in the premier and regional auction catalogues, a matched pair of Boss over and under guns from the pre-1914 period in original condition has realized figures between $80,000 and $150,000 depending on provenance, condition, and the presence of the original case and accessories. Single guns from the Robertson period in documented shooting condition consistently reach $30,000 to $50,000 at auction figures that place them above comparable examples from Purdy and Holland in the same period, a fact that the collecting community notes and that the established hierarchy of the London trade has traditionally declined to comment upon. The reason serious collectors pay a premium for original Boss guns is not sentimental, it is functional. The Robertson single-trigger mechanism, fitted by hand, to tolerances that Robertson himself established and that his successors have maintained without alteration, produces a trigger pull and a reset characteristic that no modern production gun, however expensive, however precisely machined by CNC equipment that Robertson could not have imagined, has yet equaled for consistency across a long shooting day. Competitive clay target shooters who have shot both understand this and discuss it with the candor of people whose scores depend on the accuracy of their equipment assessments. They do not always say it in print. The gun press has advertisers to consider. The physical site of the original Boss & Co. workshop at 73 St. James's Street, London, is today occupied by commercial premises. The specific tenant has changed more than once in recent decades, in a building that retains its Georgian streetscape but carries no public acknowledgement of the mechanical work that was done within it. There is no blue plaque. There is no interpretive panel. The London that replaced the gunmakers with estate agents and luxury retailers did not, for the most part, pause to mark what it had displaced. The Royal Armouries in Leeds holds examples of Boss & Co. production across multiple periods available to researchers with appropriate credentials. The Victoria and Albert Museum's metalwork collections include documented London best examples from the Edwardian period. The Cody Firearms Museum in Wyoming holds American provenance examples that arrived in the United States through the export trade of the pre-war years, guns that crossed the Atlantic in the luggage of men returning from English shooting seasons and never went back. The surprise that the Boss & Co. story leaves behind is not mechanical, it is botanical. John Robertson, in addition to his work on the over and under action maintained through his years at Boss & Company, a serious private interest in rose cultivation, a pursuit he shared with several other London craftsmen of his era in the tradition of the skilled artisan who applied the same discipline of patient systematic refinement to a living thing that he applied to metal. Robertson corresponded with the Royal Horticultural Society on the subject. His notes, held in private hands and not yet fully catalogued, describe an approach to grafting and rootstock selection that the horticulturalists who have examined them describe as methodologically consistent with his approach to action design. Identify the problem, eliminate the variables, find the solution that cannot be improved upon, and stop. He never exhibited. He never published. He simply grew roses in the same spirit that he built guns, because the problem of making something alive and precise and beautiful was, to his way of thinking, always worth solving. What Boss & Co. represents across 2 centuries of continuous operation is something that the economics of manufacturing have made increasingly difficult to name without sounding like an elegy. It is the proof that a mechanical problem solved with sufficient intelligence and patience produces an answer that time does not improve upon, only confirms. Robertson's over and under action is not historically significant because it was first. It is historically significant because it was right. And the measure of how right it was is not found in the Boss & Co. order books or the auction records or the royal warrant certificates. It is found in the guns that Browning and Perazzi and Krieghoff and Beretta produced in their millions across the following century, guns that went to the answer Robertson had already written down, without for the most part acknowledging the handwriting. The London gun trade understood craft as the accumulation of tested knowledge. Knowledge that lived not in patents or manuals, but in the hands of men who had been shown directly and physically how a thing was supposed to be done. When that chain of transmission broke, the knowledge did not survive the break. The firms that lost it did not get it back. The firms that kept it, the handful that remain on the London proof list today, did so not because they were profitable, but because someone at a critical moment understood that what was being preserved was worth more than what it cost. Boss & Co. is still making guns. That sentence is the whole argument. And somewhere on a driven pheasant shoot in the English countryside, on a cold October morning, on a peg at the edge of a wood, with the birds coming over high and fast in the particular grey light that England produces in that month, a Boss over and under is being mounted to a shooter's cheek. The single trigger is being pressed for the first time, and the action that John Robertson designed in a London workshop 115 years ago is doing exactly what he built it to do. Quietly, completely, without compromise. If you have followed this story to this point, the next video on this channel will take you to another workshop, another patent, another name that the industry built upon, and the history books have not always remembered clearly. Subscribe and we will see you in the next one.